The first thing I noticed when I opened the door was the sharp sound of fabric brushing against skin, and for a split second, my brain couldn't quite make sense of what I was seeing. The light from the small bedroom window spilled across her, outlining her in a way that made everything too clear. My aunt, the woman who had raised me for most of my childhood, was standing there, her blouse halfway down her arms, the soft curves of her shoulders bare, and she didn't move to hide herself. My breath caught before I could stop it, the air feeling too thick to swallow. I should have looked away. I should have mumbled an apology and shut the door. But my feet stayed rooted, my hand frozen on the doorknob, and she simply looked at me, her eyes holding mine with an expression I couldn't read, something between calm acceptance and quiet challenge. The silence was unbearable, stretching out like it had a life of its own. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on her dresser and the soft hum of the ceiling fan, every sound amplified by the fact that neither of us spoke. My heart was pounding so loudly it was hard to tell if it was just in my ears or echoing around the whole room. I told myself it was an accident, that I hadn't meant to intrude. I'd just come to tell her dinner was ready, that's all. But something in the way she stood there, completely unbothered, made the situation feel different. Like it wasn't just a mistake to her. My mind was spinning, trying to decide whether to turn and run or to say something, anything, that would make this less strange. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze still locked on mine, and a faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Not mocking. Not exactly warm, either. More like she knew something I didn't. My pulse raced faster, my palms starting to sweat as I realized I was breathing shallow, quiet breaths, almost afraid to disturb whatever this was. A million thoughts collided in my head, memories of her brushing my hair when I was little, of her scolding me when I stayed out too late, of her voice calling my name from across the yard. She was my family. She was supposed to be safe ground. And yet, right now, the air between us felt like it was buzzing, full of something I couldn't name. My throat felt dry when I finally tried to speak. I'm sorry, I managed to stammer, my voice sounding smaller than I wanted it to. I expected her to turn away then, to laugh it off or at least pull her shirt back on. But she didn't. She just took a slow step toward me, the movement so measured it sent a shiver crawling down my spine. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. It was as if my body had forgotten how to listen to my mind. Her eyes softened then, and for the first time, she broke the silence with a voice low and steady. "You're always in such a rush," she said, almost like she was talking about something else entirely. "You never stop to just see." The words sank into me, confusing and strangely heavy. I swallowed hard, not sure if she was scolding me, teasing me, or trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. My pulse kept thundering as I stepped back toward the hallway, desperate for the safety of distance. But her hand lifted slightly, just enough to make me pause again, caught between leaving and staying. I didn't understand why I felt so drawn in, why the sight of her like this wasn't just awkward but unsettling in a way that stirred something deeper. My stomach was tight, my thoughts a tangle of guilt and curiosity. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't going to be something I could just forget. The image, the feeling, it was already burned into me. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the scene replayed itself in my mind with painful clarity, the tilt of her head, the softness of her voice, the way she didn't flinch or hurry to cover herself. It was maddening, like a song stuck on a loop that I couldn't turn off. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, wondering why it felt so impossible to let go of what had happened. It was just a moment. Just a mistake. But it wasn't fading like mistakes usually do. It was sitting in my chest, heavy and restless. By morning, the smell of coffee drifted into my room, warm and familiar, pulling me from the restless fog of my thoughts. I dragged myself out of bed, hoping the routine of breakfast would shake the tension out of me. But as soon as I stepped into the kitchen, there she was. She stood by the counter, hair loose around her shoulders, wearing an oversized sweater that slipped just enough to reveal the slope of one bare shoulder. My stomach clenched in an involuntary knot. She looked up as if she'd been expecting me, her eyes lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary before she turned back to pour coffee into 2 mugs. "Morning," she said, her tone smooth, casual, almost too casual. I mumbled a greeting back, keeping my gaze fixed on the floor as I moved to sit at the table. The chair scraped against the tile, the sound too loud in the stillness between us. She slid a mug in front of me and sat across the table, folding her hands around her own cup. Her nails were short and neatly kept, her fingers curling lightly against the porcelain. For some reason, I couldn't stop noticing these small details. They made me feel strange, unsettled, like I was seeing her through an entirely new lens. "You left pretty quick yesterday," she said after a sip, her voice steady but laced with something that made my pulse jump. My mouth went dry. I stared down at the swirl of steam rising from my coffee, unsure how to respond without giving away how much the moment had been haunting me. "I didn't want to bother you," I managed to say, my voice sounding thin, evasive. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving mine now, like she was measuring every flicker of expression on my face. "You never bother me," she said softly, and it should have been comforting, but instead it pressed down on me in a way that made it hard to breathe. I took a sip of coffee, the bitterness doing nothing to steady my nerves. The silence stretched again, thick and tense, broken only by the faint ticking of the wall clock. I thought she might change the subject, talk about the weather, or the grocery list, or something safe. But instead, she tilted her head and asked, "What did you see, exactly?" My heart thudded painfully against my ribs. I felt heat rush to my face, an ache building in my throat. I didn't know what she wanted me to say, whether she was testing me or trying to pull the truth out of me. My fingers tightened around the coffee mug. "I wasn't looking," I said finally, my voice low. Her lips curved into that same unreadable half-smile I'd seen the day before, and she gave a small nod like she'd expected my answer all along. She stood then, carrying her empty mug to the sink. I watched her from behind, the drape of her sweater shifting with each step, the faint sunlight from the window outlining her in a way that made my chest tighten. She rinsed the mug and set it down without looking at me, but her voice came again, quiet and almost distant. "Sometimes, things happen for a reason," she said. Then she left the kitchen, the sound of her footsteps fading down the hall, leaving me sitting there with my untouched coffee and 1,000 questions clawing at the edges of my mind. The rest of the day felt like walking through a fog I couldn't escape. Everything looked the same, the living room with its worn couch, the faint smell of laundry detergent lingering in the air, the muted hum of the fridge, but none of it felt the same. My aunt had gone out sometime after lunch, leaving me alone in the house, yet it was as if her presence still lingered in every room, woven into the air. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone, flipping through channels on the TV, even attempting to read a book, but my mind kept circling back to her voice at the table, the way she had asked me what I'd seen, like it wasn't just a passing accident but something deeper. By the time evening rolled around, I was restless, pacing my room and listening for the sound of her car in the driveway. When the crunch of tires on gravel finally came, I froze for a moment, my heartbeat quickening as though I'd been caught doing something wrong. I heard the front door open, the soft thud as it closed, her footsteps moving unhurriedly through the hallway. She didn't call out to me, didn't ask if I'd eaten or how my day had been. That quietness felt deliberate, like she was giving me space, or like she was waiting for me to come to her. I told myself not to overthink it, but it was impossible. Eventually, I found myself standing in the doorway of the living room. She was sitting in the armchair by the lamp, her legs tucked underneath her, flipping through a magazine. Her hair was slightly messy from the wind, and she looked softer somehow, almost unguarded, though her eyes flicked up the second she sensed me there. She didn't speak right away, just closed the magazine and set it aside, her gaze lingering on me in that quiet, steady way that made it feel like she could see straight through me. I stepped inside, my hands awkwardly shoved into my pockets, unsure what I was even doing there. She motioned for me to sit, and I lowered myself onto the couch opposite her. For a few seconds, we just looked at each other, neither of us in a rush to break the silence. "You've been avoiding me," she said at last, her voice calm but certain, like she was stating a fact rather than asking a question. I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just shrugged, my eyes dropping to the floor. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. "You think I don't notice," she said, "but I do. You've been different since that day." The way she said that day made my stomach twist, like the words themselves carried more weight than I wanted to admit. I could feel my palms sweating, my throat tightening again. I wanted to say it wasn't a big deal, that I'd forgotten about it, but that would have been a lie so obvious we both would have heard it in my voice. I started, then stopped, not sure how to finish. She waited, patient and still, giving me the space to untangle the knot in my chest. "I don't know what to do with it," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes softened at that, but she didn't look away. "You don't have to do anything," she replied, and the simplicity of her tone almost made it worse, because it didn't match the storm inside me. I studied her face, looking for some sign of what she really meant, but she was unreadable. She sat back in her chair, her gaze never breaking from mine, and said, "Some things, they change the way you see someone. And sometimes, they change the way you see yourself." The words landed deep, heavier than I expected, and I realized I didn't fully understand them yet, but I would. She stood after that, moving toward the hallway. As she passed, her hand brushed lightly against my shoulder, just for a moment, enough to leave a trail of warmth that lingered long after she was gone. I sat there in the dim light of the lamp, the shadows stretching across the room, and felt like the ground under me had shifted again, leaving me unsure of where to step next. That night, I found myself lying in bed again, staring at the ceiling, but this time the quiet didn't feel empty, it felt loaded, like the air itself was holding its breath. The house was still, the kind of stillness that amplifies every little sound, the distant creak of wood settling, the faint buzz of the street lamp outside my window, the slow, steady hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. My mind wouldn't stop replaying her words from earlier, about how some things change the way you see someone, and yourself. I didn't want to admit it, but I knew she was right. Something in me was shifting, and I couldn't stop it. I rolled over, burying my face in the pillow, but the faint scent of her shampoo clung to the fabric, and it was like she was there in the room with me, close enough to touch. I wasn't sure how long I stayed like that before I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. They stopped just outside my door, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. A soft knock followed, barely more than a tap, like she didn't want to startle me. My voice felt trapped, but I managed a quiet, "Yeah?" The door opened slightly, the light from the hall spilling in. She stood there in a loose t-shirt and shorts, her hair pulled into a messy bun, a glass of water in her hand. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice low enough that it felt like it was meant for me alone. I shook my head, sitting up slowly. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a quiet click. The space between us felt smaller than it had in the kitchen or the living room, as though the walls themselves were leaning in, paying attention. She set the glass on my nightstand, then sat on the edge of the bed, her weight dipping the mattress. "You're overthinking again," she said, her eyes scanning my face with that same unreadable calm. I wanted to deny it, but we both knew it would be pointless. I stayed quiet, watching her as she rested her hands in her lap, her fingers brushing lightly together. "It's not always about answers," she went on, "sometimes, it's just about sitting with the feeling. Letting it be what it is." The words should have been simple, but they landed like something heavier, something I wasn't sure I was ready to hold. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, in my throat, everywhere. She must have noticed, because her gaze softened even more. Without asking, she reached up and tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear. The touch was feather-light, but it sent a shiver running down my spine. I wanted to say something, anything to break the tension, but all I could manage was a shallow breath. She didn't move away right away, her hand lingering for just a moment longer before she dropped it back into her lap. "Get some rest," she said finally, her tone gentler now. She stood and moved toward the door, pausing for a moment with her hand on the knob. "And stop running from it," she added before slipping out into the hallway, leaving me sitting there in the dim light with my heart still racing. Long after she was gone, I sat there, staring at the door, my thoughts a tangled mess of questions I couldn't yet bring myself to ask, and feelings I couldn't yet bring myself to name. The next morning, the sunlight creeping through the blinds felt too bright, too intrusive, as if it was trying to drag me out of the strange, unsettled haze I'd been living in. I got out of bed slower than usual, my feet dragging against the floor, my mind still thick with the memory of her sitting on the edge of my bed the night before. I kept replaying the way her fingers had brushed my hair back, the way her voice had dipped just low enough to make it feel like a secret between us. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was nothing more than a caring gesture from someone who had always looked after me, but deep down, I knew there was something else in it, something that had shifted the ground under my feet. I could hear her in the kitchen, moving about with the unhurried rhythm that always made mornings in this house feel calm. But today, that calm was laced with anticipation, pulling me toward her despite the unease twisting in my stomach. When I stepped into the kitchen, she was at the stove, her back to me, humming softly to herself. She was wearing a loose, faded tank top and a pair of shorts that barely reached mid-thigh, and the sight made my breath catch before I could stop it. She turned at the sound of my footsteps, a small smile touching her lips. "Sleep better?" she asked. I nodded, even though it wasn't true. She slid a plate toward me across the counter, scrambled eggs and toast steaming in the morning light. "Eat," she said simply, turning back to the stove. I sat down, but I couldn't bring myself to start right away. Instead, I watched her move, how her hands worked with easy familiarity, how the sunlight caught in her hair, how she seemed entirely at home in her own skin. I didn't realize how long I'd been staring until she turned again, her eyes meeting mine in a way that made me feel exposed. "You're quiet," she said. I shrugged, pushing a piece of toast around my plate with the edge of my fork. "Just tired," I murmured, but the words felt like an excuse we both knew wasn't true. She didn't press, but I could feel her watching me, reading me the way she always had. After breakfast, she suggested we spend the afternoon in the garden, tending to the overgrown plants that had been left too long. I agreed without thinking, grateful for the chance to do something with my hands, something that might distract me from the tight knot in my chest. The sun was warm but not unbearable, the earth damp beneath my fingers as I pulled weeds and loosened the soil. She worked beside me, close enough that I could catch the faint scent of her skin when the breeze shifted. Every so often, our hands would brush as we reached for the same spot, and each time, my pulse spiked, my breath catching in my throat. At one point, she leaned over to reach a stubborn patch of weeds, her shoulder brushing against mine, and I felt the heat of her skin through the thin fabric of my shirt. It was such a small thing, but it lit up every nerve in my body. She didn't move away immediately, and for a moment, it felt like neither of us wanted to break the contact. When we finally stepped back, she straightened, wiping the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "You've grown," she said suddenly, her voice softer than before. "Not just taller. Different." I looked at her, unsure how to respond. There was something in her tone, something that felt like both observation and confession. My mouth opened, but no words came out. She didn't wait for me to answer. Instead, she handed me the small spade and said, "Here, finish this row." Then she walked toward the far end of the garden, leaving me there with the echo of her words and the uneasy realization that this, whatever was happening between us, wasn't going away. If anything, it was deepening, pulling me in further with every passing day. That night, the air in the house felt different, thicker somehow, heavier with something unspoken. I lingered in the living room after dinner, pretending to scroll through my phone while she cleaned up in the kitchen. The clink of dishes, the rush of water from the faucet, the scrape of utensils against plates, it was all strangely soothing, yet it kept me on edge at the same time. I could see her through the doorway, her back turned to me, her hair falling loose down her shoulders. Every now and then, she would glance over as if to check whether I was still there. Our eyes met once, briefly, and the moment stretched just long enough for me to feel it settle in my chest. She turned back to her work without a word, but the look lingered in my mind. When she finished, she came into the living room and sat in the armchair across from me, tucking one leg under herself. She wasn't holding a book or her phone, she was just watching me, her eyes quiet but searching. "You've been carrying something," she said after a long pause. Her voice was low, steady, the kind of tone that made it impossible to pretend I didn't know what she was talking about. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "I don't know what you mean," I said, though it came out flat and unconvincing. Her lips curved in a faint smile, not mocking but knowing. "You do," she said simply. She leaned forward then, resting her elbows on her knees, and her gaze didn't waver. "It's not just what happened that day. It's what it's done to you since." My fingers tightened around my phone, even though I wasn't looking at the screen anymore. She wasn't wrong, but I didn't know how to put it into words without opening a door I wasn't sure I could close again. "I can't stop thinking about it," I admitted finally, the confession slipping out before I could pull it back. Her expression softened, and for a moment, the intensity in her eyes gave way to something almost tender. "And what do you feel when you think about it?" she asked, her voice quiet but unyielding. The question made my pulse thud harder. I shifted in my seat, my mind scrambling for an answer that would be safe, but every possibility felt like a lie. "Confused," I said after a long moment. "Confused and different." She nodded slowly, as if she'd expected that. She stood then, and for a second I thought she might walk away. But instead, she crossed the space between us and sat beside me on the couch. The air changed instantly, closer, warmer, charged with something I didn't have a name for. She turned toward me, her knee brushing lightly against mine, her hand resting on the cushion between us. "Different doesn't have to be bad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked at her, searching her face for some sign of what she meant, but her expression was calm, patient. The quiet between us deepened until it felt like the walls themselves were holding it in. Then she reached out, her fingers grazing the back of my hand, not quite holding it, just touching enough to send a shiver running through me. "You don't have to run from what you feel," she said. The words landed heavy, like they had weight and shape, and I knew they would stay with me long after this moment passed. I wanted to ask her what she felt, to turn the question back on her, but the words caught in my throat. She didn't press further. Instead, she withdrew her hand slowly, her eyes lingering on mine for a moment longer before she stood and said softly, "Good night." I watched her leave the room, the sound of her footsteps fading down the hall, and sat there in the dim glow of the lamp, my chest tight and my mind racing. Whatever line we were approaching, I could feel how close we were now, and I wasn't sure which of us would cross it first. The next day moved slowly, as if the hours themselves were dragging their feet, reluctant to pass. I tried to keep busy, folding laundry, wiping down the counters, even reorganizing the bookshelf in the living room, but nothing distracted me for long. Every quiet moment left space for her face to fill my mind, her eyes, her voice, the way she'd touched my hand the night before. It was a small touch, barely anything at all, yet it had been enough to leave a restless ache in my chest that I couldn't shake. By late afternoon, I heard her moving around upstairs. The sound of her footsteps above me was oddly grounding, yet it made my stomach twist with anticipation. I didn't plan to go up there, but I found myself climbing the stairs anyway, one slow step after another, like something unseen was pulling me forward. The hallway was dim, the only light coming from the soft glow spilling out of her bedroom doorway. The door was half open, and I could see her inside, sitting at the edge of her bed, brushing her hair in slow, steady strokes. She looked up when she noticed me standing there, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Her expression was unreadable, but there was no surprise in it, almost like she'd been expecting me. "Come in," she said, her voice quiet but carrying enough weight to make my pulse race. I stepped inside, my eyes drawn to the way the light caught in her hair, the soft movement of the brush through each strand. She set the brush down on the nightstand and turned to face me fully, her hands resting loosely in her lap. "You've been thinking," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. I nodded, unable to deny it. She tilted her head slightly, studying me with that calm, steady gaze that seemed to see more than I wanted to reveal. "About what happened?" she asked. My breath hitched, but I nodded again. She didn't look away. "And what do you want to do with those thoughts?" The question landed like a stone in my chest, heavy and impossible to ignore. My throat felt tight, my hands restless at my sides. I wanted to answer honestly, but the truth felt dangerous, like speaking it out loud would make it real in a way I couldn't take back. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice low. She stood then, closing the space between us in a slow, measured way. Every step seemed deliberate, her eyes never leaving mine. When she stopped in front of me, I could feel the faint warmth radiating from her, the soft scent of her skin lingering in the air. "You're afraid," she said quietly, almost like she was speaking to herself. I didn't answer, but I knew she was right. Afraid of crossing a line, afraid of what it might mean if I didn't. Afraid of her, and of myself. She reached up then, her fingers brushing lightly against my jaw, a touch so gentle it made my breath catch. "It's okay to be afraid," she murmured. "It just means it matters." I felt my chest tighten at her words, my heartbeat loud in my ears. For a moment, I thought she might pull away, but instead she let her hand linger, her thumb tracing an absent circle against my skin. It was such a small movement, yet it made my thoughts scatter, leaving nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the steady weight of her gaze. Then, slowly, she dropped her hand and stepped back, the space between us returning all at once. "You should rest," she said softly, though there was something in her tone that told me she knew I wouldn't. I watched her turn and walk toward the window, her back to me now, her figure outlined by the fading light of the day. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I turned and left the room, each step down the hallway feeling heavier than the last. That night, as I lay in bed staring into the dark, her voice echoed in my mind, over and over, "It just means it matters," and I realized that whatever was building between us had reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. The next morning began with a stillness that felt different from all the others, like the air itself was waiting. I woke early, long before the usual sounds of the house stirred, and for a while, I just lay there, listening. No clinking dishes, no running water, no footsteps above or below, just the low hum of quiet that pressed against the walls. It wasn't the kind of silence that comforted, it was the kind that demanded attention. I couldn't stay in bed any longer. I dressed slowly, each movement deliberate, as though rushing might break whatever invisible thread was pulling me forward. When I stepped into the hallway, the faint smell of coffee reached me, and I followed it downstairs. She was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. She looked up when I entered, her expression calm but unreadable, her eyes carrying that same steady weight they had every time we'd stood in a moment that felt like it was more than it should be. "Morning," she said quietly, the words soft but certain. I returned the greeting and poured myself a cup of coffee, the sound of liquid hitting the mug loud in the otherwise quiet room. I took a seat at the table, but my eyes kept drifting toward her, drawn in the same way they had been for days. She didn't speak again right away. Instead, she joined me at the table, setting her mug down with a small, deliberate sound. "We can't keep circling this," she said after a long pause, her voice steady but low. My heart gave a sharp, quick beat, and I set my coffee down without drinking it. "Circling what?" I asked, though I already knew. She held my gaze, not letting me retreat into pretending. "You know," she said simply. The quiet that followed was heavier than anything we'd shared before. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my hands resting uselessly on the table. There was no room left to run from it, not in the way she was looking at me now, not with the way my chest tightened in response. I wanted to ask her what she meant, to make her put it into words so I wouldn't have to, but I knew this wasn't a conversation she intended to lead alone. "I'm scared," I admitted finally, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them. "I know," she said, her voice softening. "So am I." That admission, so quiet yet so certain, sent a rush of heat through me. I didn't know if it was relief or something far more dangerous. She reached across the table then, her fingers brushing against mine. It wasn't a full grasp, just the faintest connection, but it was enough to send every thought scattering. "You feel it too," she murmured, not as a question but as a truth she already knew. I didn't answer, but I didn't pull away either. Her fingers stayed there, light against my skin, the warmth of her touch seeping in slowly, grounding me even as it set my nerves alight. The moment stretched, unbroken, until it felt like we were suspended in something that existed outside of time. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that carried more weight than words, and withdrew her hand. "Whatever happens next," she said, her eyes holding mine, "it matters that it's ours." I sat there in the quiet that followed, my chest tight, my mind both racing and utterly still. There were no easy answers waiting for me, no safe way to step back from where we stood now. But as I watched her take a slow sip of coffee and turn her gaze to the morning light spilling through the window, I knew one thing with complete certainty: whatever this was, whatever it became, it wasn't going to fade. It had already rooted itself too deep. And somewhere inside me, I realized I didn't want it to. If you felt the weight of this story, don't forget to show your support, hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves powerful storytelling, and subscribe so you never miss our next deep, emotional journey. Your comments matter too. Tell me how this story made you feel. Let's keep the conversation alive in the comments below.